Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. As you all know or may know, Pam focuses on science and how to help honeybees. Considering how humans can realistically apply the science is very close to our mission. We are really excited to have Dr. Jennie Durant here today to present to all of you. Through talking to beekeepers and growers, Dr. Durant brings us information about what the barriers are to making real change possible for honeybee health. Dr. Durant received her PhD from UC Berkeley in Environmental Science, Policy and Management. Currently, she is a USDA NIFA-sponsored postdoc at UC Davis and UC Riverside. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Durant, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Is my camera on?
Yes.
Great, thanks. And just a clarification, my slide, it mentions that I'm at Oregon, and my advisor recently moved to Oregon, but I was at Riverside until about a month ago. So, and I'm at Davis as well. I'm jointly mentored. So, all right, I'll go ahead and jump on in. Good morning / afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're coming from. Thanks so much for coming today. So my talk is titled The Barriers and Incentives to Adopting Bee-Friendly Practices in Almond Orchards. And as was mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Davis in Oregon, and I'm collaborating on this paper, which is primarily what I'm presenting on today, with Dr. Lauren Punizio, who is at Oregon and was just at Riverside. And then I collaborated on this survey with Emily McNamara, who was getting her master's degree at Duke University as well. So I want to just give a little background about my previous research. So I did my dissertation at UC Berkeley, and while I was there from 2013 to 2019, I studied beekeepers and almond growers, particularly beekeepers, and how they had changed their management practices from about the 1990s or mid 80s to the about mid 2000, around 2010, 2015, how they changed their management practices to pollinate for the almond industry. And one of the things I also focused on was their experience while in the almond industry. So I was looking at pesticide practices in almond orchards during bloom. And I have a paper coming out on that with Dr. Brittany Goodrich at the end of this year. And one of the things I also looked at was how pesticide labeling processes and regulation also affect pesticide use and shape which pesticides growers use. So that'll be part of that paper that's coming out in November. And we now see that Brittany and I have a paper coming out now, that an ARE update that shows that 88% of all US bee colonies are coming to California for bloom. So we know it's imperative to the bee and almond industry to create healthy orchards for bees to be in while they're here. And we still face some challenges in that. So this led to my postdoctoral research. It's been about a year in so far. And my main research question has been, what are the barriers and incentives that are shaping growers' adoption of bee-friendly practices? So something I think we're all interested in as we're trying to think about how to make pollination more sustainable for beekeepers. So the first part of this research is a survey, and that's what I'm presenting on today. And it will be coupled with interviews in the second, basically starting early next year. So the survey, we ran the survey from December 2019 to February of this year. And I collaborated with Emily, as I mentioned there. We offered a $20 gift certificate to growers. We also sent out postcards to 6,000 growers. And the survey looked at a number of their adoption of bee-friendly practices, and I'll talk a little bit more about the survey in a second. And so this talk today and the paper that we've submitted looks at growers' self-selected incentives and challenges, and also we use statistical analysis to tell us what the incentives and challenges are too. So there's two parts to this talk, which are what did growers say, and then what did our statistical analysis tell us. And I'd love feedback on what you make of the results as well. We're still trying to analyze and or contextualize the results we got. So any feedback you have on that would be wonderful. So the survey looked at, it was all online, and it asked about operational and demographic details. But we looked also at the adoption concerns and incentives about bee-friendly practices. So cover crops, pollinator habitat, the almond boards, BMPs, which I'll show you what we use in a second. Their interest in bee-friendly certification and pollination concerns and just sort of details like average frame count, average price of the colony. And so we have some, Brittany and I have some papers coming out on that this fall. And then the bee-friendly certification and the almond board BMPs will also have more detailed papers. So we're primarily looking at sort of generally what the incentives and barriers were for these different practices here. And you can see on the right of the slides, we have sort of this was sort of how the question about concerns was asked. So they could select different buttons for what the different concerns were, and then we aggregated them as a whole. So as for the BMPs, we sort of separated them into recommended by the Almond, I'm saying Almond Board BMPs, I know they were collaboratively created, so they're not just from the Almond Board. So forgive my shorthand there, but the BBMPs is sort of how we refer to them here. And so we have the ones that are recommended. So for example, water sources are covered. We're not applying, growers shouldn't be applying highly toxic or toxic pesticides or pesticides with residual or extended residual toxicities. They should be applying fungicides in the afternoon, late afternoon or evening when bees are not present, not be applying insecticides, and not be tank mixing. And then on the right, we have the sort of legally required BMPs, which are providing a 48-hour advance notice when there's a labeled bee toxic application, ensuring bees are never sprayed directly with pesticides, and reading the pesticide label protocols. So just a quick overview. I know most of you know all of those BMPs very well, but just wanted to overview those. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that we had to do our responses a little different for the BMPs. We had effort made and usually and always for the legal because we were collecting emails and we wanted to respect that this was a legal practice. So that was how we, instead of doing never, sometimes always, we asked it a little differently. So I'll dive into the survey results first. But before I do, I wanted to show you the variables that we use for our statistical analysis because those are the ones I'll be reporting on from the survey. We had a lot of survey results, but this is what we've selected for this paper. So it's a little bit confusing. The X just means that we used it in our regression analysis, our statistical analysis. So the major variables were land tenure. So did they own more than 50% of their acres? Operation size, how many acres they manage, what region they were in. So we used Sacramento Valley. We asked by county, but then we've separated it into Sacramento Valley and then North and South San Joaquin Valley. Whether or not a PCA, bee broker, or beekeeper was influential in pollinator management decisions. So not just in general, but specifically about pollination management. The satisfaction with the price and the strength of their colonies in 2019. And then a number of concerns about future pollination. So the cost of bee colonies, the lack of available colonies, declining bee health, a potential lack of skilled beekeepers, and loss of native pollinators. And then the last one was whether or not they had planted cover crops or permanent pollinator habitat. And we only used that on bee certification. And then these are the 5 practices we looked at. So whether they had grown cover crops, whether they had grown pollinator habitats in 2019, whether they always practiced the BMPs or the legally required BMPs, and then their interest in bee certification. So an overview of our demographics, we had 329 respondents, which represented about 14% of the industry's acreage in 2019. This map is sort of a heat map of where where our respondents were coming from. So we had a lot coming from Stanislaus County, and the spread is fairly reflective of where growers and acreage are in California, in the Central Valley as well. The majority of our respondents were male and had operation sizes from 1 to 49 acres. This was sort of our age spread here. And then the majority were owner operators, meaning that they were responsible for day-to-day management. This is some information on pollination. I'm just going to skim over a couple of results here. First is that the majority of all of our growers were renting bee colonies, so 72%, whereas about 11% were renting some and supplying some of their own. 9% supplied all of their bee pollination, and then about 6% the orchards were not mature enough for pollination. In terms of who supplied the colonies, 65% obtained theirs from beekeepers and 20% from bee brokers. We have, let's see, I think 4% were from another grower, and then 5% were not applicable because they maybe were not mature enough for pollination, or they supplied their own pollination. In terms of where bees are coming from, 25% were coming from near the orchard, 22% were coming from, so either in the same county or an adjacent county. 22% were from California, so a non-adjacent county, and 41% were coming from out of state. And I just want to highlight that we also looked at the percent of growers per region, and we saw that Sacramento Valley growers, 42% were obtaining their colonies either in the same county or nearby, whereas North and South San Joaquin had 22%. We assume this is because of the high population of queen breeders that are in Sacramento Valley. So this is an adoption rate of bee-friendly practices. So we have about 51% either growing or interested in growing cover crops. So 35% were growing cover crops, 16% interested, and then 28 and 21 were not sure or not interested. We have a lower adoption and lower interest in pollinator habitat. So about 38% were either growing or interested. So 19% growing, 19% interested, and then the rest were not sure or not interested. So for the adoption of BMPs, again, we have a separate paper that's going to detail the BMP adoption, but so we just chose whether they always selected it. And so 29% of growers selected that they always practiced all the recommended BMPs, and 60% of growers always practiced all the legal BMPs. And then interest in bee certification, the majority was, 74% had some interest, but most of it was moderate, followed by strong. And then whether or not they'd planted cover crops or habitat, the majority had not planted forage, but pretty sizable amount had planted either cover crops or pollinator habitat at the time of the survey. What I found really interesting was their satisfaction with cover crops versus pollinator habitat. So for cover crops, we had about the same amount were satisfied. So 46% were either very or somewhat satisfied, with 8% not. Whereas with pollinator habitat, a lot more were only somewhat satisfied. So 64% were somewhat satisfied and 25% were very satisfied. So we can kind of start seeing that pollinator habitat is generally sort of, the growers aren't as satisfied with that experience. They're less interested in it. They're doing it less. So we see this overall trend towards cover crops being a much more viable option for the industry, and pollinator habitat being a bit more of a challenge. When we look at who is influential in making pollinator decisions, so we did ask separately about what type of pesticide PCA growers were using, whether it's independent or affiliated, but for our analysis, we combined them. And so we have about almost 40% say their PCA is influential in making pollinator decisions, followed by beekeeper and then bee broker. And you remember, as you guys all know, bee brokers are, or probably know, bee brokers are used less often too. And then I thought this was interesting as well, the satisfaction with the strength and the price. So HBC is just honeybee colony. So the most growers were very satisfied with their strength at 46%, where 34% were somewhat satisfied. We had a sizable amount preferring not to answer for each. Maybe it was closer to the end of the survey. I'm not sure why. And then we had most growers found the price to be fair, but a third did find it too expensive, which comes up a bit later in the survey as well in some of our results, our statistical results. And then these, and sorry about all the bar graphs here, but I'm going to kind of, not going to go into a ton of detail here, but just provide a little bit of an overview. So these are the incentives that growers selected themselves. So we offered all the responses on the left here for them to choose from. And as if you remember from earlier, there'd just be like buttons and they could just select which ones were incentives. And then this is the aggregate of all of our respondents. So what's really interesting is the number one response across, or incentive across every single practice, was increasing the strength of bee colonies during bloom. So that's for BMPs, permanent habitat, cover crops, and certification. And the secondary one incentive for 3 of the 4 practices was a decreased rental fee for managed bee colonies, which I know is a bit of a debated issue especially I know more for beekeepers, and that it's a bit of a hot topic, but that was one of the responses. It was a 4th most popular response for cover crops. So the second most was associated benefits from non-pollination services, so nitrogen fixing, help with soil and water retention. And then also just getting access to the equipment needed to plant the seeds was another major incentive. We see that private cost share programs are right about as popular, just a little bit more than federal cost share programs for cover crops. Whereas for permanent habitat, there's more interest in the federal cost share programs than private. And supporting native pollinators is about a 4th most popular incentive. And for BMPs, we see that besides decreased rental fee, we have the ability to attract high quality beekeepers. And then lowest was processor handler request to implement almond board BMPs. And let's see, and then certification incentives, here are some of the incentives there. So price premium, a cost share program, and ability to attract high quality beekeepers were about around the same. So then we get to some of the challenges. Again, there's a lot here, so I'm just going to briefly overview some of the top ones. So the biggest one was the effort and time to manage cover crops, followed by, I thought this was interesting because there's research that sort of suggests that this is actually not an issue, or seems to show that there's not an issue there, that there's increased risk of frost damage is still one of the number 2 concerns. So it's exciting because I know that there's Almond board funded research showing that frost damage is actually not a concern, that it is colder during near the ground, but not up near where the fruit would be. But this just looks like messaging on that still needs to continue. Availability of water was an issue. Interestingly, expensive water was lower, so this made us think that growers maybe are relying on winter rainfall more than irrigation for cover crops, but we'd love to have a little more information about that, and that's kind of one of the questions I'd pose to you, why availability of water might be a higher challenge than expensive water. And then here are some of the other ones. I want to note incompatibility with irrigation system and its location as a concern, because I'll come back to that in a little bit. So for permanent habitat, the number 1 concern was the lack of available land, followed by effort and time, similar to cover crops. And then the associated costs with labor and et cetera. And then we also had some concern about pest populations. Water availability was also an issue. Expensive water was also much lower. So again, some questions about why that is and what water growers would be using to water their pollinator habitat. Lastly, we have BMP challenges. The overwhelming response was that they had no challenges, but then they also, another major concern was the amount of ground an applicator can cover during a day, so that might play a role in tank mixing, for example. Limited communication with beekeepers was another concern, as well as labor costs to apply pesticides and fungicides in the afternoon and evening. And there were some other concerns here as well. So then we have, we asked about bee concerns. It was basically like, how would you rank these concerns about future pollination? So we have loss of native pollinators. I'll start at the top. So colony cost was the #1 concern by far. In terms of the difference between the strong and moderate concern, it was their strongest concern, followed by declining bee health. So these are two really important concerns to growers. Lack of available colonies, lack of skilled beekeepers was less of a concern, and then loss of native pollinators was more of a moderate concern than a strong concern for growers. And we use all of these as variables in our analysis. So I just want to return really quickly back to the final variables that we chose. So again, these are the concerns I just went over: the honeybee price and string satisfaction, influential beekeeper, broker, and PCA, region, acreage, and majority own. So some of you might wonder why we didn't use irrigation. Like we had thought about using irrigation between rows, like maybe you had or sprinklers, but we actually didn't see any real difference in irrigation. So at first, we looked at growers whose irrigation methods, who selected incompatibility with irrigation for CCs. So one of their challenges was that my irrigation is incompatible. And we compared it to growers who did not select incompatibility. And what we found was that there was a little bit higher, double drip was higher for those who selected incompatibility, which again makes sense. Sprinklers seems like it could go in between rows. And micro sprinklers, we see a lot more here, solid set and micro sprinklers for those who did not select incompatibility. So there's this mindset that perhaps double drip might be a little more associated with an incompatibility with cover crops. And then with pollinator habitat, again, same thing, who selected incompatibility, we see more double drip and more flood. Again, probably because it would go between the rows rather than, say, around the perimeter where pollinator habitat might be located. And then we see sprinklers a bit higher, with sprinklers a bit less selection of incompatibility. But when we looked at people who are actually growing cover crops and those who are not, the irrigation is almost the exact same. So double drip, I mean, you can see micro sprinklers, 34%, single drip is 10, it's 12, 11 for solid set, 9 for solid set here, 20%, 23%. So irrigation looks about the same for both pollinator habitat and cover crops. So it does not seem that irrigation is a limiting factor for those who are choosing to adopt. I've spoken with a few people who have some thoughts about that, but we need to do some more research about that as well, because it seemed intuitive that irrigation might play a bigger role. So I want to talk now about the results of our statistical analysis. It's going to be in the form of a somewhat boring table with p-values, so my apologies, but this seems like the simplest way to actually go over the results. So if you look here, we've got the variables at the top, and then the independent variables at the top and dependent variables on the side. And the statistical analysis, we're choosing what's statistically significant, meaning sort of what has the highest effect, and then, but then also not little enough variability that it has statistical significance. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what variability means here. But essentially, when you have this higher z-score, it's indicating a larger effect size. So region was one of the biggest predictors, really, or was statistically significantly, statistically significant in 4 out of 5 of the different practices. The effect size is different within each one, but it was the most consistent variable across the 5 different practices. So it played a role in region. Growers in Sacramento Valley were statistically significantly more likely to adopt cover crops than those in North or South San Joaquin Valley. It was about the same for North and South San Joaquin Valley. If growers thought the cost of bee colonies was a strong concern, they were less likely to adopt cover crops. So meaning they're worried about the price of bee colonies, and so they are not wanting to, invest in the extra cost of supporting bees with cover crops, or perhaps planting cover crops for other reasons as well. If they were concerned about the lack of available colonies, they were more likely to adopt cover crops if it was a strong or a moderate concern than if it was not a concern. So just so you know, we're not comparing these to each other. We're comparing them to within themselves. So, so basically we're saying it's more likely if it's a strong or moderate concern than if it's not a concern. But we're not saying that cost of bee colonies is more important than satisfaction of price or bee colonies. It's a little bit complicated, but just trust that this is a statistically significant result and this is a statistically significant result. So any of the yellow ones are statistically significant, and any of the ones that have text are not statistically significant, but close. So statistical significance is with p equals 0.05. And so you can see here it's less than 0.0001, 0.04. So that's what I'm talking about. Just for any of you who are still new to statistics, as I am myself, I did not do this statistical analysis here. So trying to explain what that means. So in pollinator habitat grown, we have acreage was statistically significant. So with higher acreage, there was more likelihood of pollinator habitat, which makes sense. You might have more acres or more funds that you can put towards planting and maintaining pollinator habitat. Region was also, it was statistically significantly more likely if you were in Sacramento Valley to plant pollinator habitat. And then if you were, this was one's interesting, a grower was less likely to adopt pollinator habitat if they were very satisfied with their bee colonies. So it makes sense because they're happy with their colonies. They see no need to, adopt pollinator habitat to strengthen their colonies. But it's a little bit of a bummer for the grower who has very strong colonies and would like to see some kind of, diversity of forage at the site there, at the site where their colonies are. We also had two that were close to statistically significant, so trending towards significance, which was influential bee broker. So if they said they had an influential bee broker, they were more likely to adopt pollinator habitat. Or if they had a strong concern about loss of native pollinators, they were more likely to adopt pollinator habitat than those who felt it was not a concern. So a couple more here. For those who always practice the recommended BMPs, they were less likely in Sacramento Valley and a little less likely in North San Joaquin Valley, which that one wasn't statistically significant. And so we think this is likely due to higher rainfall requiring more fungicides, but we don't know exactly what practices they're doing the least there. And then if growers, and this result was kind of weird, they were less likely to always practice the BMPs if the declining bee health was only a moderate concern, rather than not a concern. So that one was kind of a weird outlier, a less intuitive response for us. To just go over the legal BMPs, they were less likely to always practice the legal BMPs if they had an influential PCA or a bee broker. I'll talk a bit more about why that might be the case, but I would love some insight perhaps from people here. And they were more likely to adopt them if they were satisfied with the strength of their colonies. So if they felt like the colonies were in really good shape, they were wanting to practice the legal BMP is most likely to protect their investment. And then lastly, who's interested in a bee certification? We see those in Sacramento Valley, perhaps because they're already adopting cover crops or pollinator habitat. And so they're kind of, there are less barriers to the certification. They're less likely to adopt a bee certification if they felt their price of their colony was inexpensive, perhaps because they're not needing the price premium that the bee certification could provide. They're much more likely if they've planted forage. So if they've planted cover crops or pollinator habitat, they're more likely to be interested in a certification. And then we had some sort of slightly less significant ones here as well. So those with the higher acreage were a little bit more likely to want to do a bee certification. And also they were more likely with a strong concern about lack of available colonies. So I want to explain something really quick here. And I might be going down a dangerous rabbit hole because, again, I'm not the statistic expert in my team. But I want to explain that just because something wasn't statistically significant, it doesn't mean that it wasn't having a positive or negative effect on growers' adoption. So I want to focus first on PCA and bee broker. So these here are the variables and these are the effects. So let me just explain real quick for those of you who are not familiar with this type of a figure. This is an estimate of the effect that these variables have on whether or not a grower adopted or planted pollinator habitat. And so what this means is that, so if we look here at influential PCA, anything above the 0 line means there was no effect. And so anything above 0 means there was some kind of positive effect. And anything below the 0 means there was some kind of negative effect. And so as you can see for pollinator habitat grown, the PCA, if you selected you had a PCA, you were on average, that's what the dot means, it's sort of the average response. It's an estimate, it's complicated, but it's sort of like the average response here. On average, growers were more likely to adopt pollinator habitat if they said they had an influential PCA or if they said they had an influential bee broker. And this was almost statistically significant, which we can see if this line crosses the 0, then it's not statistically significant. But if it doesn't cross the 0, then it is statistically significant. And the length of the line here means there's a lot of variability in the data. So, so right here, we have a little bit too much variability in the bee broker data. Some of them are saying, no, they didn't plant pollinator habitat. But for the most part, almost all growers who said they had an influential bee broker who did plant pollinator habitat, that we see a positive effect between bee broker and PCA as well. Sorry, this is the PCA line. So just because it's not statistically significant doesn't mean that growers and beekeepers and bee brokers and PCAs are having a solely negative effect. And similar to cover crops grown, we can see influential beekeeper. It's not as much, but there is a slightly positive effect with beekeepers. Again, PCAs, slightly positive effect for growing cover crops too. And here you can see Sacramento Valley, right? So this was a positive relationship. So meaning that growers in Sacramento Valley are more likely to have statistically grew cover crops more than those in other regions. So I just wanted to sort of explain that as well. I know it's a bit complicated. I can talk about it a little bit more if needed. So we were thinking, why is region showing up as so important? Or as a consistent statistically significant variable. So one of their thoughts is this is a box plot of the average water price of water source by region. So the box plot demonstrates the middle 50% of the data, and sorry, this black line is a little bit hard to see, but this is the mean of the water price here. So you can see that the sort of average water price is much lower in Sacramento Valley than, in Sacramento Valley than South San Joaquin, and a little bit more than, it's about the same as North San Joaquin. So it could be that the cost of water is playing a role, but we also saw that water expense is not as big of a challenge. So it may have more to do with just water availability, and there is much higher rainfall up in the north than in the south. And generally more water is available. So we think that's probably one of the biggest factors. But there's a couple other things that we found interesting too. So one of them, just to return to this, was that we have the origin of bees. So Sacramento Valley growers, 48% of them are obtaining their bees from near their orchard, whereas 47% of the growers in North and South San Joaquin are obtaining theirs from out of state. So is there an effect that beekeepers who are there year-round, are they having a positive effect on, whether or not growers are adopting some of these practices? Now that might be a little bit negated by the fact that beekeepers weren't selected as statistically significant, but it still could be having an influence that's, not showing up in the survey. And lastly, I thought this was kind of interesting. Again, irrigation doesn't show up as statistically significant, but But we do see an interesting shift in irrigation as you go from north to south. Sorry about my weird slide here. We had a little issue. But anyway, so micro sprinklers, which seem a bit easier, at least for cover crops, to be, reaching, especially for when seeds are being planted. We're seeing a lot of micro sprinklers in solid set up in Sacramento Valley. Whereas as we go farther south, we have far fewer sprinklers down in San Joaquin Valley and higher double drip and double and single drip, which could seem to be intuitively incompatible with, with cover crop adoption. But again, we didn't see that in actual adoption. So it could be more of a perceived problem than an actual problem. It's hard for us to say, but these are just some things we found kind of interesting to compare and think about why region is showing up the way it is. So I just want to go over some takeaways from the survey responses and from our statistical analysis, and then I want to ask you guys, the audience, a few questions. So let's see. So some of the takeaways for us. So growers are most interested in and satisfied with their cover crops. So we have the percentages here, and also there's this non-pollination benefit that we get from cover crops that we don't see as much with pollinator habitat. Although there is definite research that shows that hedgerows have the ability to attract beneficial insects and predators of problematic insects for growers. So I think that more research could be done on that, but in general, cover crops have they're in there for less time. They can be tilled in before other important things are happening in the operation that could get in the way. They may not require as much water. So there's a lot of reasons why they might be just an easier target for growers in terms of supporting bees. We also see increasing colony strength as a #1 incentive. Followed by decreased reduction in bee colonies. So I'll return to what that might mean later. Irrigation doesn't seem to be as important to adoption, but I think we need to do a little more looking into that. The cost of bee colonies was one of the top pollination concerns for growers, so I have some thoughts about that as well. Overall, growers were were satisfied with the price of their bee colonies and very satisfied with the strength. However, 34% find their colonies too expensive, so this may be a point, a compromise point or a discussion point that could help incentivize growers to adopt bee-friendly practices. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. And then lastly, only 1/3 of growers are always practicing all the recommended BMPs, and 60% are practicing the legally required ones. So some interesting data in terms of trying to increase the adoption of those BMPs. As for our statistical analysis, region was a key variable. We're still wondering why, but again, we assume this is linked to water. Would love some more input from anyone who's from the audience today. We also see that concerns about colony cost are negatively affecting the adoption of cover crops. Satisfaction with strength and price of bee colonies plays a key role in planting pollinator habitat, adoption of legal BMPs, and certification. And PCA brokers and beekeepers are not having a statistically significant positive effect on practices that we can see from these results, except brokers with permanent habitat are almost statistically significant. So we have a few recommendations and then questions for you. So one of them is that a regional approach to supporting pollinators seems like it might be the most effective strategy. That growers in South San Joaquin Valley may have a very hard time adopting pollinator habitat given the lack of water, the expense of water, and so there might be thoughts about, in terms of certification strategies, having some kind of regional approach toward a certification strategy, sort of what qualifies you as a bee-friendly grower might look different in Kern County than it does in Butte County. And I think that those distinctions seem important, and it might be frustrating for a beekeeper who wants to be, or grower who wants to be bee-friendly. We may need to have a regional approach to that, to what we define as a bee-friendly grower. Beekeepers might want to better explain, and this again, I know it's hard, I've spoken with so many beekeepers, why their cost is higher than for the industries that follow the almond industry. We see that plum and early blooming cherries are about the same cost, but there might need to be more communication about why the cost is what it is, to ease some of those concerns around cost and perhaps incentivize growers to adopt some of these other practices. I've heard this a lot in interviews with growers. They're confused. They just don't have a good grasp of how to ascertain how strong their colony is. And I know there's independent inspections and all kinds of things, but more work could perhaps be done there to sort of demonstrate the strength of colonies. But in general, they seem happy with the strength. So these are just some recommendations. It looks like the Almond Board could continue emphasizing the vulnerability of native and honeybee populations, particularly around BMP adoption. And brokers seem to be playing a little bit more of an influential role, so perhaps they could be leaned on a bit to help promote cover crops and BMPs. And last, I just want to close with a few questions for you. I would love to hear a little bit more about if there are growers on here or beekeepers who are familiar. Are growers watering cover crops and pollinator habitats? How are concerns about water playing a role in your adoption of these practices, particularly pollinator habitat and cover crops? What are some of the challenges beekeepers are facing when thinking about offering discounted colonies for, say, adoption of BMPs or, planting cover crops? I know there's issues around timing, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, either here or through emails or conversation. What questions would you recommend asking almond growers to better contextualize some of the findings that we had here? And are there any barriers or incentives that you know about that you didn't see listed in either the survey or the statistical analysis? I think that's it. Last, I just want to thank all of you for listening. And I want to thank Project ABSM for the opportunity to meet with all of you today, and my collaborators, Lauren Panizio and Emily McNamara, and also Dr. Brittany Goodrich, who's not a collaborator on this, but is with some other papers coming out of this data. And all of the beekeepers and growers who I've been speaking with since like 2012 or 2013, who've been informing this process and this research, and the Almond Board and Blue Diamond and numerous others who helped circulate our survey. We're really grateful. So anyway, I'll stop there and open it up for any comments. So thank you so much.
Jenny, thank you so much for your presentation. There's certainly a lot to dig into, and we have received several questions from our audience. Before I get into those, I was going to ask you to do just that. Leave up the questions that you have for the audience, and I just pasted your email into the chat function so that people can copy it and respond to you.
Wonderful,
so
thanks.
Can respond to Jenny and help a scientist out. That it's always based if you're willing. So, okay. In the beginning of your talk, when you mentioned that 88% of all bee colonies are going to California, were you referring to all bee colonies or commercial colonies?
It's that's a good question. That is I'd have to look it up. I'm pretty sure that it's operations that are managing more than 5 colonies, but I'd have to look really quick to check. I know it shouldn't be all colonies in the United States. It's probably all that are more than a certain number. But I don't know if we could classify that as commercial. So typically for the USDA, they're counting the colonies, operations that have more than 5 colonies. And so I think that it might be following the same rubric, but I'd have to double check on that number. It's a great question. I might be able to look it up real quick now, but maybe I'll take some of the other questions.
I think
I'm just nervous if I pull out of this screen, if I will to look it up.
Okay, sure.
I'm afraid that
and I think you were good. I will ask
to look it up.
Oh, there you
go.
go.
And I can also look some of the stuff up.
That's okay. We've got plenty of questions.
Well, I
How
was just gonna say, Grace, well, one thing I could do is I could look some of them up and then write an email to you with some of the responses, and then you could send that out to whoever came as well, if I don't have an answer off the top of my head.
Absolutely, that sounds great. We will plan to do that.
Great.
One question was, how are you distinguishing cover crop versus pollinator habitat?
It's a good question. I'm thinking, just wondering if I can get rid of my screen because it is part of it is how we asked the question. So we asked, we framed it in terms of, do you mind if I just pull out of my, is there any way I could stop my screen sharing for a moment?
Sure.
Okay, let's see.
You should have, yeah, there you go.
Okay, cool. Let me just see if I can pull out here. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. Okay, so remind me of the question again. It was the cover crops. I just want to pull up the language that we used from the actual survey.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah. So we had. All right, so we asked for cover crops. We said in this section, we define cover crops as a variety of species planted intentionally and temporarily between tree rows. And then for pollinator habitat, we said permanent pollinator habitat includes year-round herbaceous and/or woody plant species, including hedgerows, perennial or reseeding wildflower strips, riparian forests, or filter strips that are maintained along at least some of the edges of the orchard.
Okay, wow, wonderful. I'm glad you looked that up. And that we had someone else who was wondering if you distinguished between native vegetation at all and non-native.
It's a good question. No, we did not. We did not. We asked about. I'm just looking really quick. Yeah, no, we did not.
Okay, great. And then we had a comment, the percentage of growers already doing these or interested in doing the BMP seems high. Do you think the survey respondents reflect a higher buy-in demographic, as in more people were responding who were interested in the BMPs?
It's a good question. We were wondering about that. Yeah, we were wondering about that. I don't know. I would just be speculating. I mean, my thought was it would be people who wanted $20 because we were offering $20, a $20 gift certificate. And so we hoped that what that might do is incentivize somebody who maybe isn't adopting cover crops or isn't really interested in cover crop adoption, but wants $20. We were at the Almond board conference and we just handed out these cards and they had a QR code on them and they could just scan it and then take it on their phone. And so, I mean, we were just walking around to random people and saying, "Do you want $20? Here, take this survey." And then we also sent out 6,000 cards across California. So I can't really answer that question. It's very possible, but we feel that because we were offering the financial incentive that we may have also captured a lot of growers who don't have that. And we had 329 growers, which is somewhere around 5% of or maybe 4.5% of the industry. But yeah, I can't answer that for sure. I would just be speculating. I did want to say one comment to the 88% of colonies. So Brittany was the first author on this, so I'd have to confirm with her, but she does state, we do state in the article that it amounts to 88% of the total colonies in the United States. But I'm going to guess that it's still those that are operations that manage more than 5 colonies, because that's how the USDA tracks colonies. So I wouldn't say it's commercial colonies, but I wouldn't say it's all colonies in the United States either. It's somewhere around this. If you have more than 5 colonies, you're registered by the USDA and they're tracking you, and then it's 88% of those. But that would be my best guess.
Thank you, Jenny. And I'm so sorry, everyone. My internet just cut out right there, so I apologize for the disruption. We have another question that says, low adoption of almond BMPs, but at the same time, growers reported low challenges with BMPs. Do you have any insights, like they just don't care, or other insights?
You know, it was interesting. So it was, so what was interesting was that I just want to point out that it was 30% of all growers were always practicing all the BMPs. So we actually had a higher amount, I think it was 76% were either sometimes or always practicing the recommended BMPs. So, which is a pretty decent response. The reason why we didn't include sometimes or always was because we felt that the frequency of sometimes or always for the recommended BMPs was different from the frequency of usually or always for the legally required BMPs. So we felt always was consistent between the two different practices, and so that's why we leaned into always. But if you look at the, I'd have to add it up separately, but I believe it was somewhere around in the mid 70% or sometimes are always practicing the recommended BMPs, which is a pretty decent adoption rate, you know, overall. But it's just that in terms of getting all growers who were always practicing those BMPs, it was at 30%. And as to why that is, I mean, that's sort of what the interview stage will be about, trying to understand that result. I'd actually love to hear from other people, but I still think that there are probably concerns about fungicides. I know one of the lowest adoption, the lowest adopted BMP, again, I haven't looked at these in detail, was covering water before pesticide application. So that one brought the adoption rate down fairly low. And I know that fungicides are more of an issue, you know, up in like the wetter areas of the Central Valley, up north. And so our BMP analysis will dive more deeply into that, and will hopefully be coupled by some interviews as well. So we'll have a better understanding of what's behind that. But we have a similar question.
Sure. And did your survey include organic and conventional growers?
Yeah, it included both. There's a really low percentage of organic growers, so we just included all of them.
And what type of bee certification was asked about, or was it just more general?
It was general. I'll have to pause my slide sharing here for a second. Give me one sec to just pull that up again. So bee certification was, the language around that was, the following questions ask about your interest in a voluntary bee certification program, which would require growers to adopt some level of bee-friendly management practices on farm to meet the standards, such as practicing most or all of the almond board BMPs, planting annual cover crops, or planting and maintaining permanent pollinator habitat. So it was general.
Great. Okay, and then did Dr. Durant look into the availability of seed sources or availability of technical assistance for planting cover crops or habitat? I'm guessing availability to the grower as incentive or disincentive.
We looked at incentives. Hold on, let me just look up something really quick. We looked at a private cost share program for planting seeds or for the associated costs, but that was as specific as we got about that.
Sure. And were pesticide application concerns considered in the adoption of cover crops or pollinator habitat?
Can I just ask really quick, what is showing on my end? Is my screen showing?
It's your camera. So I
Oh,
think
okay, and that's it.
you're
Okay, that just helps me navigate my slides without confusing everybody. What was your question again? Sorry.
if pesticide application concerns were considered in the adoption of cover crops or pollinator habitat. I think it means for the grower.
Yeah, I think we were trying to, I'm trying to remember if we put that in the challenges. Yes. So here, let me share. Sorry, it's like multiple Yeah, there we go. Screen share. Give me 1 sec here.
Yeah, of course.
All right. Does that show full screen? Yeah, I think it does. I'm just going to leave up the screens on the side. So if you look here, potential for pesticide application to harm native or endangered pollinators was 12% as a concern. I don't believe we asked that about cover crops. I don't think we asked about that with cover crops. Yeah, so we just asked about it for permanent habitat.
Great. And then, let's see. So I have a question here. Colony loss surveys are often questioned because responses come so heavily from relatively small beekeepers. Your respondents seem to be smaller scale growers and owner operated. Do you think that is significant?
Actually, no, that's not the case. We don't have the, I was going to do a side-by-side comparison. Our response rate was actually pretty close to the, let me see if I can pull it up really quick. Give me 1 second. But what I was going to say is our response rate was pretty similar to the, sure, okay, I'm just going to show everyone my Mendeley here, sorry. Do we have the Almond Almanac? Sorry, everyone. Let's see here. You look up the California Almanac. Where is it? Almond Almanac 2019. We'll just do 2017 because I can't find my 2019 one. So if you look up the operation size, so we have, it's actually a bit lower this year. I think it's closer to 53%, our 1 to 49 acres for 2019. But it's fairly reflective. So 13% are 15 to 99 acres, 14% are 100 to 249 acres, and 12% are 250 acres. And then if you look at our response, no, sorry, where did it go? You look at our response rate, we have here, acreage, yeah. So we have 40%, so that's lower actually than the average, which was 53% in 2019, I do know that. And then 17, 16, so these are fairly representative of the industry as a whole. I wouldn't say that, I mean, yes, we don't have as many smaller growers, but it's representative of the industry.
Thank you. And because we're coming close to the hour, I think I want to end on this last question. So if we didn't get to any of your questions, I assure you we'll connect you with Dr. Durant. But Jennie, I was wondering if you could just let us know a little bit more about your future directions and how you're going to continue with this work.
Yeah, so, I'm a postdoc, so it depends a little bit on my next career step. I have another year of my postdoc, and during that time, we'll be publishing these results. We'll be publishing results on the BMP portion of the survey, and then I'll be conducting a number of interviews with growers who responded to the survey, ideally. So we can do sort of a follow-up interview and get into a little more detail about some of their responses. And find out some more about just some of the questions that we have based on our results here, and then publishing eventually those results. And then next year, it's hard to say. One thing I'm interested in looking into is some kind of sort of pollinator or forage offset program. So I am interested in trying to see if there are ways that growers could say qualify for a bee certification by helping fund and support pollinator habitat either elsewhere if they're not in a position to plant pollinator habitat themselves. So either for growers or for larger industries who want to support pollinator habitat. I'm looking into some kind of pollinator credit program. So that's an area of potential research to try and just understand different economic incentives for planting forage and habitats on orchards. And then, yeah, just a lot of publications coming out of the survey data. that's kind of the immediate future.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking your time to present these results. There's so much to dig into,
Yeah.
much more than we could get to in this hour. So just
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for your great questions. And please feel free to email me. It's really important and helpful for me to get everyone's feedback. And this is hot off the press. I mean, we're literally just wrapping up the paper and getting ready to submit it. So so it's nice to have a chance to share with everyone. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining us.